Over 3,000 people are buried in Westminster Abbey. 30 kings and queens among them. Visitors walk across every single one. You can stand on the grave of Isaac Newton, on Elizabeth the Vase, on Charles Darwin. Every gravestone is underfoot, worn smooth by centuries of footfall. Every gravestone except one, a slab of black marble just inside the Great West Door, roped off and untouchable. No visitor may step on it. No member of the clergy, not even the monarch. So who is buried in the one grave in Westminster Abbey that outranks every king and queen in the building? A man whose name nobody knows. Westminster Abbey was founded as a Benedictine monastery around 960 AD, on a marshy spit of land called Thorney Island, where the River Tyburn met the Thames. King Edward the Confessor rebuilt it in the 11th century, dedicating a vast Romanesque stone church to St. Peter. It became known as the Westminster, to distinguish it from St. Paul's Cathedral in the City of London, the Eastminster. Edward was too ill to attend his own church's consecration in December 1065. He died days later. His body was entombed before the high altar, making him the first king buried there. William the Conqueror was crowned at the Abbey on Christmas Day, 1066. Every English and British monarch since has been crowned there, with only 2 exceptions. Henry III began rebuilding the church in Gothic style in 1245, wanting it to rival Europe's great cathedrals. The last phase of construction was not completed until 1745, when the West Towers were finished. The Abbey is a royal peculiar, falling under the direct jurisdiction of the sovereign rather than any bishop or diocese. It belongs to the Crown. Over the centuries that followed, the Abbey accumulated the dead like sediment. Monarchs, poets, scientists, politicians. More than 3,300 people are now buried or commemorated within its walls. That black marble slab sits just inside the entrance, in the nave, rather than in the inner sanctums reserved for royalty. The positioning was deliberate. He was buried among kings, but the people could reach him. The grave of the unknown warrior. And the weight that stone carries, the weight that 1,000 years of royal burials do not, begins with what happened to a generation of British families between 1914 and 1918. Over 1.1 million soldiers of the British Empire were killed in the First World War. Of those dead, roughly 526,000 have no known grave. Approximately 187,000 were buried but could never be identified. The remaining 338,000, give or take, were never buried at all. Some were lost at sea. Most were simply destroyed by the industrialised violence of the Western Front. The sheer volume of high explosive shells falling on the same few miles of mud for 4 years meant that vast numbers of men were obliterated. Their bodies were torn apart, buried by collapsing trenches, swallowed by the waterlogged earth of Flanders and the Somme. They ceased to exist as recoverable remains. Historians have called it a democratisation of death. For the first time, ordinary soldiers, not just officers, were given individual grave markers. The alphabetical war memorial, all ranks listed equally, was a new concept. And yet, for more than 500,000 families, even this small dignity was impossible, because there was no body to mark. The British government's official policy compounded the grief. It forbade the repatriation of bodies. No soldier, regardless of rank, was to be brought home. The reasoning was partly logistical and partly egalitarian. If wealthy families could pay to bring their sons home while poor families could not, the inequality would be intolerable, so the policy applied to everyone. And the result was that hundreds of thousands of families across Britain had no grave to visit, no place to mourn, no physical point on the earth where they could stand and say goodbye. More than 500,000 men gone, and their families left with nothing but a telegram and a photograph. Into this grief walked a man who had buried more soldiers than he could count. David Railton was born on the 13th of November 1884 in Stoke Newington, London. His father, George Scott Railton, had been the first Commissioner of the Salvation Army, second in command under General William Booth. David was educated at Keble College, Oxford, ordained in Liverpool in 1908, and serving as a curate in Folkestone when war broke out in 1914. He volunteered as an army chaplain and arrived on the Western Front on the 10th of January 1916, attached to the 2nd Battalion of the Honourable Artillery Company. He was present at the battles of High Wood, the Aishin, and Passchendaele. He buried the dead. He comforted the wounded. He wrote letters to the families of the missing and the killed. He was awarded the Military Cross in 1916 for rescuing an officer and 2 men under heavy fire on the Somme. And it was during that year, while returning from conducting a burial service near Armentières, that Railton came upon something that would change the course of British remembrance. In a back garden at Erquingham-Lees, a small village in northern France, he found a rough wooden cross marking a grave. Written on it in pencil were the words, "An unknown British soldier of the Black Watch." Railton stood there, staring at that cross, and the question pressed itself into him like a wound. Who was he? Who were his people? Was he just a boy? There was no answer. There never would be. And so Railton began to think about what could be done to ease the grief of the fathers and mothers and wives and sweethearts who would never know where their son or husband lay. Throughout the rest of the war, Railton used a Union flag as a makeshift altar cloth, draping it over the bodies of fallen soldiers during field burial services. It became known as the Padre's flag, or the Ypres flag. He carried it with him from battlefield to battlefield, folding it over the dead as he committed them to the earth. The war ended on the 11th of November, 1918. Railton returned to Britain, but the war did not leave him. He was suffering from what we would now recognise as post-traumatic stress disorder. He walked the streets of Margate at night, unable to sleep, haunted by the things he had seen and the men he had buried. By the summer of 1920, nearly 2 years after the armistice, Railton had refined the idea that had taken root at that wooden cross in Erquingham-Lees. He wrote to Herbert Ryle, the Dean of Westminster, formally proposing that an unidentified soldier be brought from the battlefields of France and buried amongst the kings at Westminster Abbey. One man, unknown and unknowable, to represent every soldier who had no grave, every family who had nowhere to grieve. Railton had actually written a version of the idea earlier to Field Marshal Haig and received no reply. It vanished into the bureaucracy of the post-war military establishment. The letter to Ryle was his second attempt. Ryle received it with immediate enthusiasm. He made one crucial change, replacing Railton's word comrade with warrior. Comrade implied a soldier. Warrior encompassed all branches of the armed forces, Army, Navy, and the newly formed Royal Air Force, and technically any member of the British Empire. The idea expanded with a single word. Ryle wrote to King George V and to Prime Minister David Lloyd George. The Prime Minister was strongly supportive. He would later write that the cenotaph is the token of our mourning as a nation, while the grave of the unknown warrior is the token of our mourning as individuals. Field Marshal Sir Henry Wilson, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, told the Cabinet that no words could tell how proud the officers and men would be to have one of their simple soldiers buried in Westminster Abbey. The King, however, was cautious. George V feared that such an act might reopen bitter wounds, that the raw grief of the war was still too close, and that the public might not welcome it. It took the combined weight of Lloyd George, Wilson, and Dean Ryle to bring him round. On the 15th of October 1920, the Cabinet formally approved the proposal. That was 27 days before Armistice Day. 3 weeks to plan, execute, and deliver the most elaborate act of national mourning Britain had ever attempted. Lord Curzon of Kedleston was appointed to oversee the logistics. The timeline was almost absurdly compressed. Orders went out in strictest secrecy to officers in France and Belgium. Exhume unidentified British bodies from the 4 principal battle areas of the Western Front: the Aisne, the Somme, Arras, and Ypres. The soldiers who did the digging were not told why. 4 bodies, each confirmed as British by their boots and buttons, but with no rank or name identifiable, were brought by field ambulance to Saint-Paul-sur-Ternoise, roughly 20 miles west of Arras, where British Army headquarters were based. Each body was laid on a stretcher, covered with a Union flag, and placed in a makeshift chapel. They arrived at different times, by different routes, so that no one could track which had come from which battlefield. At midnight, on the night of the 8th to the 9th of November, 1920, Brigadier General Louis John Wyatt, the officer commanding British troops in France and Flanders, entered the chapel with a single companion, Lieutenant Colonel E.A.S. Gell. They were alone, the door closed behind them. Wyatt walked to the 4 stretchers, closed his eyes, and placed his hand on one of the shrouded figures. That was it. That was the entire selection. No committee, no deliberation, no record of which battlefield the chosen man had come from. Wyatt and Gell placed the body in a coffin shell and screwed down the lid. The 3 remaining bodies were removed and reburied. Their locations were never publicly confirmed. A memo in the National Archives, dated 2 days later, stated it plainly. You can say with absolute certainty that no one in this world knows where he came from. Wyatt became the only living person who could have known the origin of the man he chose. And even he could not have been certain, because the whole point of closing his eyes was to make certainty impossible. The following morning, the coffin shell was placed inside a specially made outer casket of 2-inch thick English oak from a tree that had grown in the grounds of Hampton Court Palace. The coffin was lined with zinc, banded with iron hooped handles. On the lid, a 16th century Crusaders sword from the Tower of London's collection, personally selected by King George V. An iron shield bore the inscription, "A British warrior who fell in the Great War 1914 to 1918 for King and Country." And draped over the casket was Railton's own Padre's flag, the same Union Jack he had used as an altar cloth in the mud of Flanders. The outer casket had been made by Walter Jackson of the firm Ingle, Parsons and Clive Forward at Wealdstone in northwest London. The undertaker's nodes and son supplied the fittings. A coffin fit for a king, built for a man without a name. The coffin was taken under military escort to Boulogne. The French 8th Infantry Regiment kept vigil overnight. On the 9th of November, 1920, the procession through the streets of Boulogne was led by 1,000 local schoolchildren, marching in silence. Church bells tolled across the town. French cavalry trumpets sounded au chant, the French equivalent of the last post. A division of French troops escorted the coffin to the harbour. Marshal Foch saluted as it passed. The coffin was placed aboard HMS Verdun, a Royal Navy destroyer chosen specifically as a compliment to France, given the significance of the Battle of Verdun to the French nation. 6 barrels of soil from the Ypres salient accompanied the coffin, so that the unknown warrior could lie on the earth where so many had fallen. 6 Royal Navy destroyers provided escort across the English Channel. At Dover, on the 10th of November, 1920, the unknown warrior arrived to a 19-gun salute, an honour normally reserved for a field marshal. 6 warrant officers from the Royal Navy, Royal Marines, Army and Royal Air Force carried the coffin ashore. The bell of HMS Verdun was later donated to Westminster Abbey. It hangs there still near the grave, a permanent marker of that crossing. The coffin travelled by special train to London Victoria Station. The railway carriage used had previously carried the bodies of Nurse Edith Cavell and Captain Fryatt back to Britain. a Daily Mail reporter who watched the train pass through the darkness that night, wrote of a dark, wet, moonless journey, of the train thundering through stations where groups of women stood watching in silence, many dressed in deep mourning. At the platforms it rushed past, upper windows were open, and against the golden square of light, the silhouette of a faithful watcher stood framed in black. The train arrived at platform 8 at 32 minutes past 8 in the evening on the 10th of November, 1920. The coffin remained at Victoria overnight, under guard in the funeral carriage. A plaque between platforms 8 and 9 marks the spot today. The Western Front Association holds a commemoration there each year at that exact time. And then came the 11th of November, 1920, 2 years to the day since the guns fell silent. The procession left Victoria Station at 20 minutes to 10 in the morning, the coffin drawn by 6 black horses of the Royal Horse Artillery on a gun carriage. A steel helmet, sidearms, and a belt were placed on the coffin. The cortege travelled through Hyde Park Corner and along the Mall to Whitehall, with lines of troops standing heads bowed, rifles reversed. As the procession set off, a Field Marshal's salute was fired in Hyde Park. Huge, silent crowds lined the streets. Many were weeping. At Whitehall, the procession paused for the unveiling of the permanent cenotaph, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens and built in Portland stone, replacing a temporary wooden structure that had been erected the previous year. As Big Ben struck 11 o'clock, King George V unveiled the cenotaph, and a 2-minute silence was observed across the entire nation and empire. Traffic stopped, factories fell quiet, ships at sea sounded their horns and then said nothing. For 2 minutes, an empire held its breath. If you are finding this worth your time, subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and there are centuries of London still waiting to be told. The king placed a wreath of red roses and bay leaves on the coffin. His card read, "In proud memory of those warriors who died unknown in the Great War, unknown and yet well known, as dying, and behold they live." After the last post, the procession continued to Westminster Abbey, now followed on foot by the king, his 3 sons, the royal family, the Prime Minister, and ministers of state. The coffin was borne into the West Nave by a bearer party from the 3rd Battalion, Coldstream Guards. Lining the nave stood a guard of honour composed of 100 holders of the Victoria Cross, drawn from all 3 services. The congregation of roughly 1,000 was composed almost entirely of war widows and mothers who had lost sons, chosen by ballot from thousands of applicants. Both Houses of Parliament had agreed to forgo their own attendance so that the most bereaved could be present. Among the congregation were 100 women specifically invited as guests of honour who had lost both their husbands and all their sons in the war. As the coffin was lowered into the grave, King George V scattered French soil from a silver shell onto the casket. Trumpeters sounded the Reveille in answer to the last post that had been heard at the cenotaph. Dean Herbert Ryle himself conducted the burial service. The same day, simultaneously, a French unknown soldier was buried at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, making these 2 the first tombs of the unknown soldier in the world. The grave had been planned to remain open for 3 days. It stayed open for a week. An estimated 1,250,000 people visited Westminster Abbey in the days following the burial, queuing for hours in the cold and rain. Some accounts describe the line stretching for 7 miles through the streets of London. Contemporary newspaper reports described 2 wounded soldiers who walked 60 miles to lay wreaths at the grave. Old women came from remote villages in Scotland and Wales. Bus drivers slowed their vehicles as they passed the Abbey. Passengers stood and removed their hats. One policeman recorded the story of an elderly woman from the far north of Scotland who had carried a bunch of withered flowers all the way to London. She said they came from a little garden her boy had planted when he was 6 years old. The Daily Telegraph described it as the greatest public outpouring of emotion that Britain had ever seen. The contemporary writer Ronald Blythe called it morbid, but grandly, and supremely so. He was not wrong. There was something almost medieval in the spectacle of a city filing past a single grave, hundreds of thousands of people united by a grief so vast that only an anonymous body could hold it all. One of the Abbey's own choristers, Bill Wolferstan, who had sung at the burial service, later recalled wondering whether the unknown warrior might be his elder brother. The flowers and tributes at the grave continued for almost a year. On the 18th of November, 1920, the grave was formally filled using 100 sandbags of earth brought from the battlefields of France. A temporary stone was placed over it. 1 year later, on Armistice Day, 1921, the temporary stone was replaced by the permanent slab that remains today. Black Belgian marble from a quarry near Namur, 7 feet by 4 feet 3 inches, 6 inches deep. The brass lettering was made from melted down First World War ammunition. The metal of the war, recast as words of remembrance. Dean Ryle composed the inscription. Its final line reads, "They buried him among the kings, because he had done good toward God and toward his house." At the same service, the Padre's flag was formally dedicated and hung in St George's Chapel within the Abbey, where it remains to this day. Railton was present. He watched the flag he had carried across the battlefields draped over the coffin of a man he would never know. His own role in the creation of this grave was deliberately hidden for years. He was unwilling to accept praise. His name was virtually unknown to the public until the 1930s, when an article appeared in the magazine Our Empire. Railton died on the 30th of June, 1955, after an accidental fall from a train at Fort William in Scotland. He was 70 years old. A memorial to him now stands in Westminster Abbey, a short distance from the grave he made possible. His daughter, Dame Ruth Railton, went on to found the National Youth Orchestra of Great Britain. On the 17th of October, 1921, General John J. Pershing of the United States Army conferred the Congressional Medal of Honor on the unknown warrior, the highest military decoration the United States can bestow. Congress had approved this by an act of the 4th of March that year. In return, the Victoria Cross was placed on the grave of the American unknown soldier at Arlington National Cemetery, presented on behalf of King George V by Admiral of the Fleet Lord Beatty. That Victoria Cross is the only one never officially gazetted. The Medal of Honor now hangs in a frame on a pillar near the grave at Westminster Abbey. On the 26th of April, 1923, Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon married Prince Albert, Duke of York, at Westminster Abbey, the man who would become King George VI. Elizabeth had lost her brother, Captain the Honourable Fergus Bowes-Lyon, at the Battle of Loos in 1915. His body was never recovered. As she entered the Abbey with her father, Elizabeth suddenly left his side and placed her bridal bouquet on the grave of the unknown warrior. She did this before the ceremony, not after. Before the official photographs were taken. Before the newsreel cameras were rolling, which means that no photographic record of that bouquet exists. The most famous bouquet in royal wedding history has never been seen. Reporters noted the gesture touched all hearts. It began a tradition that has continued to this day. Every subsequent royal bride has sent her bouquet to rest on the grave, even those who did not marry at the Abbey. The Queen Mother, before she died in 2002, requested that her funeral wreath be placed on the unknown warrior's grave. It was. After Queen Elizabeth II's funeral in September 2022, a bouquet was placed on the grave the following day, echoing her own 1947 wedding bouquet. On the 4th of November 2020, Queen Elizabeth II made a private visit to Westminster Abbey to mark the centenary of the burial. She was 94 years old. She wore a face mask, her first time wearing one in public during the pandemic. She placed a bouquet based on her 1947 wedding flowers. Present were only the Dean of Westminster and her equerry. On Armistice Day itself, a scaled-back service was held owing to the pandemic. The poet laureate, Simon Armitage, read a poem composed for the occasion, 100 Years Closing, the granddaughter of the king who buried him, standing alone at the grave of a man whose name no one will ever know. The unknown warrior's grave has never been disturbed. Beneath the black Belgian marble lie the remains of one British serviceman, inside the Hampton Court oak coffin with its crusader's sword, resting on 100 sandbags of French battlefield soil. Above him, the brass letters forged from the ammunition of the war that killed him. On the pillar beside him, the Congressional Medal of Honor. On another pillar, the ship's bell of HMS Verdun. Nearby, a stone commemorating Dean Ryle, who composed the inscription that half the nation can recite from memory. He could have been from any regiment, any rank, any age, a general's son or a ploughman's son, a teenager or a grandfather, a Scot, an Englishman, a Welshman, an Irishman. He could have been anyone. That is the entire point. Every year, approximately 40 sets of British remains are still discovered on the battlefields of France and Belgium. Most cannot be identified. They are buried as unknowns by the Ministry of Defence's Joint Casualty and Compassionate Centre. The work of finding the missing continues more than a century after the guns stopped. The simultaneous burials in London and Paris in 1920 became a global template. The United States followed with the tomb of the unknown soldier at Arlington in 1921. Australia created its own in 1993 and Canada in 2000. Dozens of nations now have their own version. The tradition the British unknown warrior started was explicitly cited by the US Congress when it approved the Arlington burial. Westminster Abbey's own website describes the grave as the most visited war grave in the world. 3,000 people are buried in the floor of Westminster Abbey. You can walk on all of them: monarchs who ruled empires, scientists who remade human understanding, poets whose words outlived their centuries. Their graves are underfoot, worn smooth, barely noticed. But you cannot walk on him. The black marble is roped off. The stone is treated as ground that no living person may tread. He was buried among kings, but he was not a king. He was placed beside the entrance so that the people could reach him, not hidden in the inner sanctums reserved for the powerful and the famous. And the rule that protects his grave protects something larger than a single body. It protects the idea that the anonymous matter, that the unknown deserve the same reverence as the named, that one man with no rank and no identity can carry the grief of an entire nation on his shoulders, and that the weight of that grief is worth more than 1,000 monuments.